Is Christianity a Jewish subversion? Let's find out. So Judaism is a pretty complicated beast. It's not something that is just some flat group, and it certainly wasn't like this at the time of Christ. There were many different squabbling groups, and this goes back for hundreds of years even before Christ. You have the Hellenists, you have the Pharisees, you have the Sadducees, you have the Essenes being a particularly interesting group, you have the group in Babylonia, you have the group that's in Israel, and these groups all vary to some extent. In fact, the two copies of the Talmud that we currently have, the Jerusalem and the Babylonian Talmud, reflect points of views from different parts of the world. Because there was a big community in Babylon and there was a big communion in what is known as the Eretz Israel, or the land of Israel. So, nowadays, the situation is still quite diverse, but it's quite different. In fact, the modern Judaism that we see today is influenced by a lot of work that came later on. First of all, the Mishnah, which was compiled by Judas the Prince in the 2nd century AD. Then you have the two Talmuds that were compiled around the 4th, 5th and 6th century AD. And then you have the works of Moses Maimonides, which occur in the Middle Ages. The Judaism that Christ came into was a significantly different beast in many ways, not least in the fact that the view of God was different even among prominent Jews. For example, Philo of Alexandria had a view that Moses Maimonides, who is the promoter of the absolute oneness of God as seen in Judaism, that he would find very strange. His view of the Logos, for instance. You see many different variations in Second Temple Judaism, and you certainly don't see some sort of organised push amongst the Jews towards certain political goals in the same way that the likes of somebody who reads the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion would get the impression of. Judaism at this time was a highly fragmented system of beliefs. It wasn't really one coherent whole that could, in an organised push, attempt to undermine the Gentile nations. In fact, they were often fighting among each other, and often as a result of the influence of the Gentile nations around them, particularly the Greeks and the Romans. For example, if you look at the Wars of the Didache, which occurred after the death of Alexander the Great, you will see the political machinations that go on behind the scenes. For example, one particular Jewish family known as the Tobiad family was often involved in these sorts of dealings, which were typically between the Seleucid Empire and between the Ptolemies. Additionally, you'll see actually Gentile subversion of Jewish religion going on, particularly in the 2nd century AD, under the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes, in the persons of people like the high priest Menelaus, who was a highly Hellenistic Jew. This was essentially a political puppet for the king who was attempting to completely wipe out Judaism. So we have a highly complicated situation in the 2nd century and beforehand in the form of these families that I've just mentioned. This further becomes complicated by a civil war between Aristobulus and one of his relations, where the Romans intervene and eventually establish their protectorate in Judea in the next century. This, of course, leads to a lot of dissension as well, although this occurs later on, particularly after the death of the Herod that is mentioned at the beginning of the two Gospels of Matthew and of Luke, because the Romans eventually split it up into the Tetrarchy and begin to take more formal control. This leads to the growth in the Zealots, and this leads to the faction known as the Sicarii coming about. So, the idea of there being some sort of unified Jewish plot to undermine Gentile nations through Christianity is something that fails. Not just because of the fragmentary nature of the Jewish people at this time, down to the point where their own incompetence allowed the Romans to take Jerusalem. If you want to read about that, go and read the works of Josephus. But also because they weren't theologically unified. To suggest that there was some sort of plot or a universal plot among at least the learned to try and undermine the Gentile nations falls flat precisely for this reason. Another reason is because of the early Christian relations, and to be honest, even the later Christian relations with the Jews, which weren't 100% hostile. Up until the High Middle Ages, they were often viewed as the group that just sort of strongly held to the Old Testament without any additional accretions. But there were still some quite hostile writings. For example, you see in the Martyrdom of Polycarp, the Jews calling for the death of St. Polycarp, who was one of our most revered bishops. This was in the middle of the 2nd century, so not very long after the advent of Christianity. Additionally, if you read the writings that were written at the same time by St. Justin Martyr, who was a converted Platonist philosopher, against the Jew Trypho. Very, very interesting dialogue, actually. It even goes as far as to accuse the Jews of tampering with the scriptures, which there is some historical evidence to suggest there were trends among the Jews of tightening up their scriptures in certain areas as a response to the Christians, for example through the works of Rabbi Akiva. You also, of course, see the famous sermons by St. John Chrysostom, which occurred in the 4th and 5th century, or at least in the 4th century, against the Jews. And later on, as we go into the High Middle Ages, around the time that Orthodox Judaism was beginning to find its form in the works of Maimonides. Of course, they had the Talmuds at this point, but Maimonides is a very key figure. You see the likes of converted Jews like Petrus Alphonsus writing academic dialogues against the Jewish faith on account of the Talmud's lack of current scientific accuracy. In fact, it's often forgotten how much interreligious dialogue was actually going on in medieval Europe, particularly in medieval Spain. And so, the profound issue, to sum up for the sake of those who haven't been paying much attention, the significant issue is that Judaism was not a unified force, and it was far more diverse in its basic views of God than modern Judaism. That's the first point. The second point is that the Jews attacked the first leaders of the Christians. For instance, Polycarp knew St. John the Apostle personally, and St. John the Apostle knew Jesus. It would make very little sense for the Jews to have such a radical hatred for Christianity and to attack the leaders of the very apostles that led the faith, and then somehow this also to be some sort of Jewish subversion. It makes very little sense. And finally, the repeated intellectual sparring between Jewish rabbis and Christian theologians across the centuries makes this connection also very tenuous. The only way that this can be actually ascertained is by the suggestion and pointing out that Christianity and Judaism have a shared history in the Old Testament, which in itself is not as clear-cut as one might think on first inspection. But that's for another video. If there are any other pagan criticisms of Christianity that people can think of, and would like me to make videos responding to, please by all means put them in the comments section. I'll be responding to these on here with as much frequency as I can spare between my work on Latin manuscripts and on other topics. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.